It is France in the year 1320. The steward of a powerful lord appears at the estate of an insignificant nobleman with an offer. That is in truth a command. The lord demands that the 7-year-old son of the family serve as a page in his castle. The parents react with gratitude and pride. This means connections, education, a path to social advancement that their younger son would otherwise never have had. Within 3 days the boy is placed on a cart and taken away. His childhood ends that afternoon. What the parents do not openly say, but certainly understand, is what service at a medieval court actually entails. It is not just about table manners and handling a sword, yet the alternative to agreement would be worse. Political isolation, loss of the lord's favor, possible retaliation against the family. So they smile, bow, and hand over their child. That was the page system, and it functioned for centuries across Europe. Boys as young as 7 were separated from their families and sent into the households of more powerful nobles. Officially, this was considered the first step in knightly training. Pages were to learn courtly behavior, begin basic military training, and prepare for later advancement to squire, and eventually knight. The reality was more complicated and far darker. Pages were household servants, completely subject to their lord's will, isolated from family protection and utterly defenseless. They possessed no legal rights against their lord. If they were mistreated, there was no authority they could turn to. Their parents had handed them over and no longer had any influence on how they were treated. The system created hierarchies of dependence. The lesser nobility sent their younger sons to more powerful nobles. These in turn sent their sons to even more influential courts, to dukes, princes, sometimes even kings. Everyone participated because refusal meant exclusion from the networks of patronage and power on which medieval society rested. Household records from across Europe show that large courts maintained 20 to 50 pages at any given time. These are not just a few boys in knightly training. This is a constantly renewed supply of child labor. When boys grew too old or were sent onward, they were replaced by new arrivals. The sheer scale alone suggests that far more was involved than education. Pages rose before dawn. Their first duty often consisted of attending to their lord's morning routine, helping him dress, bringing water for washing, preparing his chambers. They were present in intimate moments when a lord was vulnerable and unclothed. This closeness was no accident. It was part of their function. Throughout the day, pages served at meals, stood behind the nobles ready to refill goblets or bring dishes. They appeared decorative, in uniform livery, dressed in their lord's colors, hair styled according to fashion, always carefully clean and groomed. Household accounts show considerable expenditures on page clothing, far more than would have been necessary for simple servants. These costs indicate that they were not merely employed, but put on display. The sleeping arrangements reveal much about the true relationship. Pages usually had no quarters of their own. They slept at the foot of their lord's bed or in an antechamber, directly outside his private room. The official justification was availability. If the lord needed something at night, a page should be immediately at hand. Yet this arrangement also made privacy impossible, and boundaries practically non-existent. The educational aspect was real, but limited. Pages learned to read and write, usually Latin and French. They received religious instruction from the castle chaplain. Older pages began military training, simple sword drills, riding, care of armor and weapons. But these lessons took only a few hours a day. Most of their time was spent in service, and this service often extended into areas about which training manuals remained silent. Medieval sources occasionally reveal more than intended. Household accounts record medical treatments for pages, sometimes for injuries that raise questions. Chronicles mention that lords showed particular affection toward certain pages. Letters between nobles occasionally refer to your beautiful young page in contexts that feel unusually personal. The punishment system was harsh. Pages could be beaten for failures in service, publicly humiliated for mistakes, or deprived of favor. In the closed world of a medieval court, where the lord's favor meant everything, that was devastating. The constant threat of being sent home in disgrace hung over them, even though this rarely actually happened, as it would reflect badly on the lord himself. At every major medieval court, observers could see which pages were favorites. These were boys who enjoyed unusual privileges, better clothing, personal gifts, protection from punishments that other pages endured, and most tellingly, private access to the lord that others did not have. Chronicles occasionally mention such relationships in cautious language. A French chronicle speaks of a lord's particular affection for a certain page. An English report describes a young page who received extraordinary kindness from his lord. These formulations seem harmless to modern readers, but a medieval audience understood the undertones. Chroniclers wrote for patrons and had to remain diplomatic, yet still wanted to convey to their readers what was actually happening. One of the best documented examples is provided by Edward II of England, even though his case began as a page relationship. Piers Gaveston entered Edward's household as a young page when both were still boys. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston eventually reached such proportions that it contributed to a political crisis. Although their relationship began in a context of clear power imbalance, Gaveston as page to the prince, it developed further as both grew older. The foundation, however, was laid in those early years of service. What happened to such favorites once they outgrew pagehood varied greatly. Some fortunate ones retained their lord's favor into adulthood, receiving offices, advantageous marriages, or even small estates. They had successfully converted their position into lasting advantage. Others were less fortunate. When a page showed the first adult features at 14 or 16, some lords simply lost interest. The favor that had defined the boy's entire life vanished, and he suddenly had to come to terms with being ordinary, or worse. The cruelest aspect was the complete vulnerability. Favorites had everything: privileges, protection, hope of advancement. Yet all of it depended solely on the continued approval of a single person. An approval that could disappear for reasons beyond their control: the arrival of a younger, more attractive page, a shift in the lord's interests, political changes in the household, or simply boredom. What decided who advanced to squire depended not only on ability or behavior. Family connections played an enormous role. A page whose family had political value to the lord had significantly better chances. A page who had earned his lord's personal favor had excellent prospects. Some pages were sent home, but this was relatively rare, as it cast a poor light on both the boy's family and the lord who had failed to train him properly. Far more often, unsuccessful pages simply remained in the household as permanent servants. Adult men who continued performing page duties into their 20s and beyond, trapped in juvenile roles. Others vanish completely from the sources, and these gaps in the record are disturbing. Medieval household accounts carefully record those pages who advanced to squire and eventually received the accolade of knighthood. Yet many pages who appear in early records do not appear in later ones. Where did they go? Some presumably died. Mortality rates in the Middle Ages were high, and life in a castle was dangerous. But the sheer number who disappear without explanation suggests other fates, ones either not recorded in the households or not meant to be recorded. Those who did advance to squire took on other duties. They accompanied their lord to war, to tournaments, and on hunts. They maintained weapons and armor. They fought at their lord's side in battle. The relationship became more martial and less domestic. Though not necessarily less close, some lords maintained close relationships with their squires well into their late teens and early 20s. The boys who succeeded in this system, who navigated it skillfully enough to receive the accolade and acquire their own land, often established their own households with their own pages. The cycle continued. Men who had experienced the system as vulnerable children became lords who perpetuated it with the next generation. Whether they repeated the exploitation they had suffered or tried to create something different, we scarcely know. The sources are silent on this, and the men themselves certainly did not write confessions. What we completely lack from the Middle Ages is a single account written by a former page describing what the experience was truly like. This silence is no accident. Pages were children from lesser noble families, perhaps educated, but without authority, resources, or a public platform to write history. By the time they might have had the opportunity as adults to record their experiences, they had either been pushed out of the system or succeeded within it, and thus had no incentive to expose practices that would incriminate themselves or their patrons. Instead, we are left with hints, gaps, and patterns. In other sources, household accounts show unusual expenditures on individual pages, gifts far beyond their station, medical treatments, sudden cash payments. Taken individually, they seem harmless, but in aggregate, they form a clear picture. Legal sources also occasionally offer glimpses. Church courts in medieval Europe theoretically prosecuted sodomy with great severity, and isolated cases appear involving nobles and their pages. But these were extreme cases, situations where behavior had become too public or too violent to ignore. Precisely these prosecutions suggest that what was punished was the exception, while other things were silently tolerated. Medieval literature often reveals more through fiction than through factual reports. Courtly romances feature beautiful young male servants in strikingly central roles. In lyric poetry, pages are described in aesthetic terms that seem exaggerated for mere household servants. These were not documentaries, but they reflected cultural realities that contemporary audiences recognized. All of this shows how historical memory works. Societies preserve what shows them in a good light and erase what contradicts that image. Medieval Europe wanted to remember itself as Christian, knightly, and noble. The page system existed within this society but contradicted that self-image. So it was documented only indirectly, addressed only cautiously, and eventually almost completely forgotten. The thousands of boys who passed through medieval courts across Europe over centuries left almost no traces. Their experiences, their suffering, their rare moments of agency, all of it was lost. Thanks very much for watching my video. If you liked it, hit like button and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.